Welcome everyone to the Galactic Collaboration Summit. Today we're going to be talking about building NPM code libraries for use with the SharePoint Framework. My name is Julie Turner. I'm a partner and CTO with Simpraxis Consulting, which is a small 6-person consulting company in the Boston, Massachusetts, United States area. And here's some information about my background as well as some ways you can find me on social media. Okay, so let's talk about the architecture of the solution. So we're going to start with having some main SharePoint Framework component. Now that could be a web part, or it could be an app customizer, or any of the, well, obviously other than libraries, but any of the project types that you want to start with, you can. So that main SharePoint Framework component ends up having a bunch of public libraries in it, and you can also then include your own public libraries. And so those third-party libraries will pretty much always come from NPM.js site. That's where the public registry is that pretty much everyone consumes from. But your private libraries, as I mentioned earlier, can be in any one of those code repository sources that you might use. I'm going to demo today using GitHub, but I have done a bunch of projects using Azure DevOps for this purpose. And of course, if you want to pay for a subscription, a private subscription on NPM, or you have a private subscription already for NPM.js, you can just use that. But the methods are all the same. So I promise to sort of point out where these things are. It's super simple. It's just a matter of going in and either signing up or registering or getting credentials for something already existing. In NPM.js, it's super straightforward. You'd go into your packages area and you can see all the packages that you have published using the npm publish command. I don't have any currently publicly available packages, but I just wanted to show you sort of where that is. So that's the NPM.js site. And then in GitHub, here's, again, this is the example I'm going to be showing today. So I've got a couple libraries already published in here. These are in a private repo. So I have a private repository in part of my GitHub account. And as part of that, I can say I would like some packages available that are inside of that private repo. So these packages are private. No one else can get access to them unless they have, unless I've given them access to that repository. And then I mentioned also Azure DevOps. It is more tricky to set up a feed, what they call a feed, which is under the Artifacts tab in your Azure DevOps. So you'll go into a project, you'll go down to the Artifacts tab, you'll click the Create a Feed button, and in my screenshot here on the left, you can see that I've got this demo feed right here, but once you do that, you then click on Connect to Feed, and that'll give you all the instructions for how to set up your npm.rc file, which you can either do in the project itself, or you can do it for your user. And I find doing it for the user is much better because you're going to need a token. So you're not going to want to check in your npm.rc file to your code repository because you don't want to share that token. That's a secret, and you want to keep it a secret, so you don't want to check it in your code repository. So I found in testing that it's significantly easier to move all that kind of information up to your at least your user level npm.rc file, so that it's all there for any of the projects you're consuming. And we're going to go through that in a little bit more detail. All right, so code structure. You know, I'm going to talk through just a couple of different options here, but of course the sky's kind of the limit. It just depends how you want to structure it based on what libraries you're building, what they're for. So the demo I'm going to do today is the most dead simple structure, in that I'm going to have all my code in one repository. So I have a repository on GitHub. I have inside of that repository, I have some folders. And the 3 folders, one is for the SharePoint Framework project that is going to sort of consume our libraries. And then what I did so that I could give you a pretty robust sample is created 2 libraries that are dependent on each other. So the SharePoint Framework project will depend on library 1, and library 1 will depend on library 2. But the way I'm going to bootstrap them in is that they're both external to the SharePoint Framework project. So we'll get into that when we get in more depth. But you could also have these libraries in separate code repositories. And I think for more enterprise type development scenarios, that's probably the more appropriate code structure. But again, doesn't really matter. You would clone those repos in sort of a sibling hierarchy, and then but the folders could also just be in various locations on the machine. It just, if you're doing local development and you're linking to the libraries by a relative path, that makes things a little more tricky. You need to make sure you're managing your package.json more personally than if you're sharing it. And so we'll kind of go into that a little bit in the future here. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the setup for when you're going to reference your libraries as an external reference. That means we're going to host both of our Webpack and bundled libraries on a CDN. And so we want to be able to reference them that way. So in that case, for our consuming solution or our consuming web part or app customizer or whatever, we're going to install the library as a dev dependency from the NPM registry that we're using of our choice, just like any other library. So it'll be, at my solution / library with a version number, because we're going to have published our package to that registry. So that's pretty straightforward. Then also in our consuming application, in our Webpack config, we're going to list that library as an external. So we'll put at my library / library name in the externals array in the Webpack config. And then in the Webpack config of the library project, we're going to add a library target to the output property so that so when Webpack bundles our library, it knows that it is a library. In the case that we might be bundling our library, and so we're building our library separately, but we're going to bundle it in each time. This isn't a scenario I generally go down, but if you were going to do that, then you can have, in the production instance, you would install the library the same way as an NPM style library. And it'll get bundled in. But if you're in a development mode when you're building that library, then you could consider just doing an NPMI with a relative path to the package.json of the solution that you're consuming. And then in the library itself, you would update the Webpack config so that you add that library target. Now, this tends to work really nicely if you're going to have multiple people working on components of an entire package, where your main consuming solution will be doing the Webpack bundling and be splitting things off into various pieces in the build chain, but you want to have different repositories managing the check-in and check-out, and you just want to reference those components all into one consuming application, but the bundling is going to be happening in that consuming application. So this is a scenario for that, but not one that I've run into a lot. So for the SharePoint framework, in general, this is super simple because because that build toolchain is not something you really have a ton of control over. The way we would manage that we have these external libraries is in the config.json file, where we would specify our externals. And you can see in the external in my external section, I have commented out the 2 references to the Azure CDN that I'm using, and put extra lines in to reference the local host of the libraries that I'm running locally. So I can have all these projects, and I can set up a bundle sync serving that serves up my libraries as on localhost ports so that I can consume them, and thereby when I change those libraries and they rebuild, my SharePoint Framework project will pick up those changes and I can see them all sort of real time. So that can be super handy way to debug our solution. But then when we want to change back and do a production build, we got to make sure we remember to come back and comment out our localhost run and change it to the Azure CDN. And what is helpful is when you do the SharePoint Framework packaging and then you go to deploy, on the deploy screen in your tenant app catalog, it's going to tell you where your packages are coming from. So if you ever see in their localhost, you know that you've maybe, and that isn't your intention, you maybe want to fix that. So then let's just quickly talk through the scenarios here. So I've kind of gone through them, but let's summarize quickly and say that when you're in development of a library, you have a couple options. One could test that library on its own using browser sync. So you're going to want browser sync in your package anyway, so that you can host it on a localhost port, so that when you're using your SharePoint Framework solution and you're pointing to it, you can serve it up from locally, so that you can iterate on it really quickly without having to publish and download the package updates, et cetera, et cetera. So you could test it locally within the project by just sort of bootstrapping into the page, an index.html page. But you can also test it bootstrapped into the SharePoint Framework, again, making that modified config.json file to point to the localhost that's serving up your library. And then in SharePoint Framework, do a development build instead of a production build. And if you deploy that development build out to SharePoint, then you can put the app customizer or the web part on any page, and it will serve your code up from your localhost. So that way you don't have to worry about the workbench not having the styles that you need, or exactly rendering it the way you think it should render. That just gives you a much more simplified way to build out a development environment, and using an Office 365 test tenant is a good way to do that. And then finally, if you're using the library, again, you're just going to do the npm install and point to the library on your private registry, and that'll get installed in your package JSON without any difficulties, assuming you have your authentication set up correctly. So I kind of brushed over this, and it's because it's pretty simple, right? So the process of, once you get your library developed and it's in a place where you want to start sharing it out, get some testing done, or build it out even further, you want to run npm version first. And the reason for that is that you want to make sure that your package JSON has a fresh version number that you have not published before, because you cannot publish the same version of a package more than once. So you might want to do a patch version, a minor version, a major version, whatever it is, depending on where you're at in your development lifecycle. But you need to do that version first. Make sure, again, that you have your credentials established in your npm-rc file to support that private registry that you're trying to publish to. And then you're going to run npm publish. And it's just that one line. I included the link so that you can go read a little bit more about the process. But basically, you just type npm publish, and it will publish your package out to your private repository. You might want to consider doing a --dry-run first to validate what your deployment package is going to look like. And then sort of last but not least, when you do that publish, you can only publish that version once. So make sure you've done a production build first to make sure there's no errors in your build. And then you could consider using the pre-publish script in the package JSON to guarantee that you're doing a production build before it publishes. Of course, if you're using that and you're relying on that and it fails, you have a problem. So there's a somewhat of a chicken and egg situation here, but it's good to just know that that's a process you should go through. And so I mentioned the npm-rc file. Here's just a quick sample of the various ways that the registration happens. This is complicated. I admit that even though I had good instructions, it took me a while to get it all set up properly. But once I figured it out, you're good to go. And so then any additional GitHub account or ADO org that you want to reference, because if you're working with various organizations or various repositories, you might need that. And so you can add all of those to your local npm-rc file to support all your development in your development environment. All right, so let's take a look at what it all looks like when it's up and running. So let's start with a demo. And so we're in Visual Studio Code right now. And I'm showing you the model where I have one repo with the 3 folders inside of that one repo. Obviously, this is maybe not conducive to multi-team environment, but when I'm building these individual pieces, and especially in this demo, this helps position it pretty well. So let's start with the lowest level of the library. So we have this lib1-1, and inside of there, we have created an index.ts file. And in that file, we're going to export out the things that we want to be available externally. So when the library is being utilized, these are the things that the consuming project can get access to. So we have what we're calling a container item, and then the container item has properties. And so we're going to expose those out. And so if we look at the container item and we start at the top, we can see that we have those container item props, and the container item prop is an item, and it is of type lib item, and the lib item has a title, description, and URL. That means when we call our container item, we need to make sure that we pass in an item that has a title, description, and URL. And then our React control can be bootstrapped in and show the title, description, and a button that launches the URL by opening that in a new blank window. So this is what this little library does. It's just that one component. What's interesting here is that we've set up our package.json so that we have a private library. And by private library, I mean especially specifically in GitHub, but also in Azure DevOps, the library has to have a namespace to it. So the @Julie Turner is Julie Turner is my GitHub area, and so we're going to publish to Julie Turner lib1-1 as a private library, NPM library. And so some of the things that we had to do, we mentioned that we have 2 dependencies where we're dependent on React and React DOM. And we have all these dev dependencies, but these dev dependencies are primarily only used to build and serve our solution locally so that we can test it and utilize it. So that's what's in our package.json. And then we have a Webpack config that's going to bundle our library. Now, this is pretty standard with the exception that in our output path, we needed to make sure that we set a target. And I use UMD because it's the most globally accessible, but obviously you do what needs to be done based on the project that you're building. The other thing that I wanted to do is specify that React and React DOM are external. So I don't want the library to have those code bases bundled into them, because I'm going to reference them as being on the page with my SharePoint Framework extension. So the only thing I'm doing in my package.json is I'm making sure that my React packages match what is being used in the version of the SharePoint framework I'm using. So that's important, but we are specifying them as externals. And then the other thing that we did is we have a gulp file over here. In this gulp file, we specify a bunch of tasks, and some of those tasks that are important are build and serve. So we can do gulp serve, and when we do that, we're going to use a local package called browser sync. And the browser sync is going to help us to note that when something changes, the server needs to be refreshed. And so This will serve this up, and we can specify by default it's on port 3000, and so we'll, for this library, we'll leave it at the source. And so we can do a gulp serve, and when gulp serve runs, it'll load this index.html file, which is bootstrapping our container item into the DOM, into this DOM element I created there, and passing in a dummy element that we can use to test things. And so then if I come over to a console here and we go to lib11 and we do a gulp serve, then what will happen is on our website, or our web server, or web browser, excuse me, it's going to load that index.html, and we're going to have a live instance of our code. And so what we can then do is, if I decide to come in and change this to pink, for instance, what a horrifyingly bad idea. But if I do that and I come back over to our site, you can see it already changed this to pink. And so it allows you to sort of get that real-time sort of hosting experience so that you can work on in dev this one particular component. Okay, now let's move on to the second piece of our chain. So we went over lib11, and now let's look at lib1, which consumes lib11. And so let's start by looking at our package.json for lib1. In most respects, it's exactly the same. We've just added a new dependency. We're going to be dependent on our lib11 library. And in this particular case, because I haven't published these libraries yet, I'm going to do a file reference to lib11. And the reason I'm doing that is from a development experience. If I'm going to be developing both of these libraries at the same time, I might want to see how lib11 behaves inside of lib1. And so I'll serve them up at both at the same time, and that way I can tweak them. So when we have that package then set that way, we can set up, again, we're having an index TS file that's going to export what the consumer of this library will need to call. So we have this lib1 launcher, which is the bit of service code that will bind this component into our DOM. And we have some props for it. And so in that container, we have the props for this lib1 launcher. And so the props that it takes is the DOM element that you want to bind it to and a set of items that you want to publish. And so if you note, the items is just an array of the ilib item that library 1.1 needs. So when we look at the container that we're going to bind into the DOM, we can see that when the items come through, we're just going to walk through all the items and instantiate a container item. This container item comes from our lib1.1, and so we'll just make, and we're just going to pass in the item as an individual item out of that array. So we're going to just make a container with multiple items inside of it from the library. So if we go back to our launcher, we can see that once we pass into the constructor the properties that we need, we bind those in, and then we call launch. And once we call launch, that that runs render header, and render header will append the container element into our DOM element header and render it. So that puts that into the DOM, and we can then work on it. And so again, similar to the other lib1, we can work with that locally. So I can serve this. Let me just stop what's going on here, and oops. Let me run that again. Lib1, excuse me, let's go over here and gulp serve that. And so we're just going to get a second entry of that. That's no big deal. And then in a minute here, we're going to get the lib11 library. Okay, so notice that we're running on port 3010. So we are definitely want to, so we can run these both at the same time, we're going to run them on 2 different ports. But notice that we're just having these items inside of here. And if I change something in lib11, it will definitely flow through to lib11, and we can, see how everything's behaving together. So that's really powerful way to sort of continue the development experience. Obviously, once lib11 is solid and there's no changes to be made, then you can npm publish that, and then back in your package.json, instead of doing a file reference, we would do instead a reference directly to the published library. In this case, let's say it was the first version of the published library, so it would be just 1.0.0. And then again, what we want to do is in our externals for lib1, we want to make sure that that library is also external, not only React and React DOM, but also that library, because we're going to bootstrap that in separately from our CDN. Okay, finally, let's talk about SharePoint Framework and how we're going to bootstrap our libraries into this. So in the SharePoint Framework, we have an app customizer in here. And so in the app customizer, in our package.json, we've imported not only lib1, but also lib1_1, so that we have both of these external libraries into our package. And then what we're going to do is in our config.json, we have to specify what our external packages are. So what we would do in a production environment is we would reference the package, but then with the URL to the Azure CDN where we're hosting them. In a development scenario, we can replace those paths with our local host paths. And so as long as we're gulp serving both of our other libraries, we can continue the development chain so that we can see all the pieces running all at once. So I'm going to leave it as localhost. And then just to explain what's happening, in our library application customizer extension, we're going to require React and React DOM. And this is just a way so that so SharePoint Framework knows that we need to load, we are requiring React and React DOM. It'll be already available on the page, but we need to make sure that the SharePoint Framework knows we need it. We're also then going to import from lib1 the lib launcher, because we need to bootstrap that in. And then separately, we need to require lib1_1 again, so that it adds into our manifest package that we need this library and where to go find it, and it'll know where to go find it from our config. So we did our imports, and then in our render, we're just going to set up things. So we're going to go and get using the placeholder provider on the context, we're going to get the top placeholder provider, and then we're going to just set up some items. In this case, we could be passing to our launcher the HTTP client or the SPHTTP client to go get some items. In this case, I'm just mocking them up. And then we're going to create the lib1 launcher, passing in our DOM element and our items, which we defined here. And then we're going to call launch, which will render that in the page. Now, again, we can gulp serve this. So if I go over to SharePoint Framework and I gulp serve this, and then that's going to get that running. It takes a few seconds to get it going. And since I don't have my my config set up, it's not going to pull it into the right spot, but I have it running here in SharePoint. So I'm going to just refresh the page to prove the point. So our library chaining now is going to pull in our test items with our red buttons. You see they were yellow, now they're red because we restarted everything. So the red buttons are in here, and now this page is live. And if I go change things down the chain, they're going to, and refresh the page, they're going to show up as changes in here. So that is the one caveat. This page will only be refreshed manually. It's not going to refresh as you change the code, but it's a good trade-off to make, to have this great tool chaining so that you can test out your libraries live. Awesome. So now that we've seen it all running, I just want to provide a few resources. NPM 5 changed the way NPM link works. And so I had talked about NPM link when you're using the SharePoint Framework library project type, you might want to read that if it's something that you want to use so that you can get familiar with how NPM Link works a little bit more. I mentioned Browser Sync. That's a really cool tool. It's all set up in the project that I'm sharing out with you that's in the code samples in my public samples repository. So you can go ahead and get started with that, but I wanted to provide a link so you could learn a little bit more about it. And again, go check out the code sample, which is the full set of libraries in SharePoint Framework projects. So you can use that as a getting started jumping off point for building your own NPM libraries. Awesome. Well, I absolutely thank you for joining me today, and I hope you really enjoy the Galactic Collaboration Summit. Thanks.
Thank you for being a part of the Galactic Collaboration Summit. Join the community and meet in-person world-class Microsoft and MVP speakers this autumn in Wiesbaden, Frankfurt, Germany, with 15 full-day tutorials and over 150 Microsoft 365 and Azure sessions at the combined European Collaboration Summit and European Cloud Summit from 26 to 28 October 2020. Community rocks.